I'm Daisy. You might remember me from such instructional videos as how to get away with the perfect murder, how to dispose of a corpse, barbecuing large pieces of meat, and why Jack had to leave England. But today I'm not getting you onto the FBI watch list. Today I'm just going to show you how to use dialogue in stories. It's so easy that even Jack can do it, although not particularly well.
How dare you!
In a story, the dialogue is where characters are talking to one another. To some people this is utterly terrifying, to others it's not difficult at all. If you are among the first group, then you have a bit of a problem, since most stories are extremely heavy on dialogue. With notable exceptions, even an average modern action movie will be mostly characters talking to one another. Dialogue is inescapable. It's a huge part of the way stories have to be told. As a rule, we should always show, and not tell, the audience what's happening, and the most basic way to do that is to have one character explaining it all to another. In some stories we can encounter a huge lump of exposition in the form of a monologue. This is the terrible cliché in many forms of tale where the villain finally reveals all of their plans to the hero, usually while they're tied up and waiting to die by some ridiculously overcomplicated means.
No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die.
Most stories will use dialogue more sparingly, and with greater skill, but not all. It will usually be a two-way interaction that either moves the plot forwards or else reveals some detail that fleshes out our understanding of the character. Anything where two or more people speak during a scene is dialogue, and without it, we're unlikely to have very much of a story. The idea comes down to understanding the difference between direct and indirect speech, quotes and dialogue tags. Luckily, it's nowhere near as hard as it sounds.
Oh, that's lucky.
All active speech between two characters goes into inverted commas. What happens inside those commas is almost completely unfettered by normal rules and regulations.
The hell with the rules.
Those commas form the boundaries of grammatical requirements and the tenets of societal norms. The only thing in there that matters is punctuation, where the rules remain absolutely firm. The words you write inside those commas are the words your characters say. Accordingly, they aren't absolutely required to follow the rules. People simply do not speak the way the language requires us to write, so your sentence structure can be off and the words can be less accurate than they might need to be. In extreme cases, you might choose to misspell words in order to infer a very heavy accent, and you might use words that aren't entirely correct.
What's he saying? What's he saying?
In terms of a story, all of this is acceptable. In many books, swearing is avoided, even though it might be commonplace in the situation you're describing. Such things can make the story seem less believable, and so a balance has to be struck. As a general rule, having the normal structure of dialogue stray too far makes the work hard to read. If it's done exceptionally heavy-handedly, it can literally stop the story dead, killing the drama and forcing the reader out of the narrative entirely. For that reason, it's usually best to compromise, to find a way to suggest the right tone without accentuating all of the faults that stray into normal speech.
You know what, mother?
Dialogue should have a point. It's not enough to stop your story and have a brief conversation just for the sake of it. The dialogue is a part of the action and has to be used to move things along. The conversation should have a point that resonates with the characters and drives the development of the plot. The conversation should reveal something about the story or people you're writing about. It must fit into the narrative. As a rule, if it doesn't add anything to the tale you're telling, then don't add it.
Hello? Hello?
Apart from the initial meetings, we don't usually tend to bother including greetings. Although people will routinely go through a polite ritual when they meet their friends of saying hello and shaking hands, we don't need to include that every time. We should include a welcome when two characters meet for the first time, as that will likely add to our understanding of them, and might well move the plot along. The same is true with small talk. We don't need to add details of minor conversations and can quickly summarize them if they're worth a mention. In such cases, we'll usually resort to indirect or reported speech.
We are learning so much!
A lot of people have difficulty remembering the difference between direct and indirect speech, with indirect speech often referred to as reported speech. There is an easy trick to help us remember which is which. Direct speech is when you are directly quoting what someone said. You are quoting what they said, and it must go in quotation marks, also known as inverted commas, and you are quoting it directly. Indirect speech is not this, it's when you are saying what someone said, but you are saying your own version, and it's not strictly accurate, therefore it didn't take a direct route from the person who said it, to the person who is hearing it. Remembering it in this simple way really is half the battle. Direct speech is a direct quote, from the person who said it to the person who hears it, while indirect speech is not. The rules around indirect speech are fairly informal, but the rules around direct speech are not. This, of course, means that direct speech, which you use most often in writing, is actually easier to work with.
I kinda doubt it.
Direct speech is made up of two parts, the quote and the dialogue tag. The punctuation pertaining to the actual spoken words happens inside the inverted comma and stays inside the inverted commas. If the spoken sentence stops with a period, an exclamation or a question mark, then that will all happen inside the quotation marks. The speech tag, however, is not always impacted by the punctuation and does not need to begin with a capital letter because the sentence hasn't really ended. Just to make it even more fun, if the spoken sentence has ended, we don't end it with a full stop if we're adding a speech tag, we end it with a comma. We only end it with a full stop if that's the actual end of the complete sentence. The quote is what was said and is always inside quotation marks. The quote can end with one of four things: a full stop, a comma, a question mark or an exclamation mark. Once it's ended, we close it off with another quotation mark. The quote will stop with a full stop only if it's the end of the complete direct speech sentence. For that to work, we'll have to begin with a dialogue tag, such as, Daisy said, and then move on to telling the audience what she said. In sentences like that, we use a full stop because the entire thing has finished when we reach the end of the quote. We can also end it with a question mark, or an exclamation mark if either one is appropriate for the quote. In sentences like these, the dialogue tag must end with a comma before we begin our quote. It's also worth noting that whatever is inside the quotes is treated as a sentence in its own right, and must therefore begin with a capital letter. As we put our dialogue tag at the end, then the rules are very slightly different. We begin with our quote, in quotation marks. We never end with a full stop, since the sentence is not ending, and we use a comma inside the quotes instead. We make an exception for both exclamation and question marks, since they give us extra context that is too important to miss out. Our dialogue tag does not need to begin with a capital letter, unless it's a name, of course, and then we continue as normal. And that's all there is to it.
All too easy.
Indirect speech doesn't have any dialogue tags or quotation marks, and we're not showing a piece of speech going directly from one place to another. This is used where a person is telling someone what someone else said. In writing, just as in normal speech, we use this for things that are worth noting, but aren't important enough to dwell on. If something is important, we quote it directly. If it's not that big a deal, we just tell someone what was said. With indirect speech, we're under no requirement to quote the other person, in fact we're more likely to just give the gist of what was said. So a typical sentence from direct to indirect might be, "I'm explaining how this works," said Jack. This would change to, "Jack told me how this works." Notice that in indirect speech, there is no particular punctuation that we need to use. It's a simple sentence with the sentence subject performing the action of saying something.
I don't like this.
Another rule with dialogue is that each character's words need their own paragraph. We can add actions in another sentence once the spoken words are complete, but they should originate with the character who said them. Once we switch to the other character, we must start a new paragraph. This helps the audience to follow a conversation, knowing that the paragraph breaks are a good indicator that someone else is now speaking. Once we add an occasional reminder of who that is, the reader should have no trouble understanding what's happening.
That's how it should be.
So, the basic rules for dialogue are to keep it meaningful, keep it interesting and keep it to the point. Remember that speaking is an action and the dialogue must conform to the rules of any other action that is carried out by your characters. If there's no point in it, don't add it. Use it to move your story along and make sure it adds something of interest to your work.
You can go now.